Hello, my name is Jeff Cartwright, and I lead a consulting practice that's involved mainly in nearshoring. By nearshoring, I mean moving products which have been traditionally made in China, maybe for the last few decades, moving them to North America, predominantly to Mexico. In that practice, we specialize predominantly in manufactured goods, generally speaking consumer products, and the state of Guanajuato has some great possibilities in expanding its presence in nearshoring. Principally, because it's involved in automobile manufacturing, it means there's a lot of metalworking from casting, operations, sheet metal, processing and fabrication of metal. And then it also has a very strong injection molding industry. And when I look at consumer products, smaller appliances, those are the principal technologies within that, plus a few electronics that we might need to import from India, Vietnam, or China. But principally, Guanajuato already has those capabilities in very great industries. So the question is, how do we go from the present state of Guanajuato participating in a minor way in nearshoring to expanding those opportunities and reaching a lot of small to medium enterprises in the state? So I want to talk principally about nearshoring and where we are relative to the U.S. trade war between China and the United States, or the global trade war between China and the United States. That trade war has been going on for 5 years. It is sparked mainly by concern around defense technologies, the growth of China being very aggressive, not only economically, with military, increasing its military, and the potential invasion of Taiwan. All of those are of grave concern to Americans, and our President Trump put on extraordinary duties on China during his first term. He is also, by the way, campaigning for another term, and he has mentioned that he may put on 60% tariffs onto China. So what we have here is a once-in-a-generation opportunity where the global supply chains are going to be reset. We're going to be in a much more regional economic bloc, which is North America. And so the integration between Canada, the United States, and Mexico started with NAFTA, continue with USMCA, is only going to get deeper and stronger in many additional industries. However, that once-in-a-generation opportunity has a time window on it. It's open right now because U.S. chief executive officers are concerned about China and their resourcing. Once you find a factory or build a factory to supply your products, that's going to last for the next 8, 10, 15 years. So there's an opportunity right now, given the pain that U.S. executives are experiencing, to reshore, onshore, or nearshore products. Once we've done that, that need evaporates and is gone for the next generation or so. So the window is open. It's probably open for the next 5 to 6 years. At the end of that time, the U.S. will have reshored everything that it intends to reshore. That which is left in China will be basic commodity items. It'll be non-threatening items to our defense. It'll be things that we don't think are important anymore. Those things that we are going to onshore or reshore or nearshore, or the other term is friendshore, are going to be those things that the North American economy, the American people, the Mexican people, and the Canadian people are dependent upon. Next, I'd like to talk about foreign direct investment in Mexico from all countries around the world. There's been a lot of talk in Mexico in the last year or two about how much Chinese investment is coming to Mexico. I want to talk about the year 2022, which is the last year that we have complete economic data. In that year, there was about $35 billion invested in Mexico from all countries. About half of that investment is from the United States, and about half of that investment is in the auto industry. And clearly, Guanajuato and other places in Mexico have benefited from that investment, with the auto industry being the largest industry overall in Mexico. The Chinese, although rumored to be interested in Mexico, of the $35 billion had invested $300 million that year. In other words, rather inconsequential. Other countries make up the balance of that. If we look at all Asian countries, about $3 billion total. So again, terribly insignificant compared to the partnership between the United States and Mexico. So let's look into the year 2023. In about halfway through that year, Tesla announced investment in a major factory in Monterrey, in Santa Catarina, a southwest suburb of Monterrey. Since that time, there have been a lot of interest in Mexico by Chinese firms that would hope to supply Tesla in Mexico with various components. In fact, there's been 29 companies, according to the governor of Nuevo León, and that investment is around $8.5 to $9 billion. What I want to caution people is that investment didn't take place in 2023. It's an announcement, and the investment takes place over several years. For example, just this week alone, the governor of Nuevo León talked with the CEO of Tesla and asked him when he's going to break ground and actually begin construction, because it's been over 6 months. They're not going to begin construction for maybe another 2 or 3 years. So it's an illusion. This $8.5 billion is going to be spread over several years. And of course, in 2024, we'll have additional announcements about investment in Mexico from the US, from China, and other places. But this, I guess the general comment is, China is investing in Mexico, but not significantly so far. The United States is still the largest investment partner in Mexico. The next thing I'd like to talk about is a projection about how much nearshoring will benefit Mexico as an economy in general. So I have a bar chart that we will show, and that bar chart is a projection by Morgan Stanley, a well-known US investment and wealth management company. And they're projecting a major increase in the amount of business that Mexico will have in terms of exports to the US based upon nearshoring. So that total amount of increase in exports from Mexico to the US in the next 5 years or the next 4 years is projected to be a $155 billion increase. Next up, I want to talk a bit about the major factors that the US executives have when they consider nearshoring or consider buying any product. The number one objective is total cost of ownership. That is to say, the cost of the product, the logistics, the duties, the tariffs, and everything it takes to put that product in his warehouse. So he's looking at the total cost of not just purchasing the product, the manufacturing of the product, but the delivery to his warehouse so that he can then subsequently ship it on to his customers. So total cost of ownership winds up to be the number one criteria. A lot of times people think in Mexico that the US will purchase products from Mexico if the cost is significantly higher than what is the landed cost from China. That is simply not true. The number one criteria is to be cost competitive. The US buyer will purchase products for a little bit more on a landed cost basis, but not 30 or 40% more. So one of the other things that I hear very commonly in Mexico is we can't compete with China. China is too efficient in that. This next bar graph, which is up on the screen, speaks to that. If you look at, this is manufacturing cost in an annual salary per worker. On the extreme left is the United States and Western Europe. On the extreme right is Mexico, the next to last bar from the right. And if you notice, China is somewhat in the middle. So Mexico, since 2015, actually has a lower average factory wage salary than China does. And if you look at the bar, Vietnam also has benefited a lot from nearshoring, movement, or from reshoring, movement from China into Vietnam to avoid the tariffs. Vietnam is out of capacity, and as a result, its labor and its cost structure have gone up significantly in the last 3 years. So Mexico is attractive even to the Southeast Asian countries. Next up is a bar chart done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, a well-known global consulting firm. It was produced in the year 2020 before we got into the issues of the pandemic and those things. What I want to point out is the reference is the second bar from the left. That is China cost on a reasonably complex industrial product, and the total cost comes out to be, with transportation and everything at the U.S. warehouse door, at about $1,000 a unit. If that same product was made in a factory in the United States, that cost would be closer to $1,400 a unit. So China is very attractive to the U.S. cost structure. Move over to the next one, and it's Mexico. And this speaks to the fact that Mexican labor is more efficient, the transportation movement is more cost effective, and as a result of both NAFTA and USMCA, there's no duties and tariffs on products from Mexico to the US. That is the distinctive cost advantage, is both labor and the duties and tariff, and proximity to a lesser extent. Moving to the right is another low-cost country. That would be Vietnam. And you can see Vietnam is slightly lower, but remember, this study is dated 2020, and Vietnam's costs have gone up considerably. So I would expect if the study was republished, those bars would be about even with Mexico. Now, one of the assumptions in this is in the lower part of each bar, notice that the raw material costs are the same in every country. That is simply not true. In every case, it's assuming a cost for all the raw materials coming into the factory of $524, regardless of the country. That's not true. China very heavily subsidizes basic materials, in particular steel and aluminum. So what I'm saying there is if the product is very heavy steel and aluminum and very low labor content, China is likely to be more attractive than Mexico. However, if we go up the complexity curve, we go up the technological spectrum, Mexico becomes very competitive with China very quickly. So where has nearshoring occurred in Mexico? In the year 2022, there are studies published that major expansion of nearshoring or bringing jobs to Mexico and investment in Mexico is Nuevo León. By far and away, well over half the investment in Mexico was done in that city. It's a little bit out of capacity. This next map of Mexico shows where investment is from 2021 through the first half of 2023. And as you look at that map, you can see investment is spread out throughout many different states in Mexico. But I want to point out that the state of Guanajuato has somewhat underperformed. If you look there in the center, the total nearshoring that has occurred for the state of Guanajuato is 4% of the Mexican total. Yet the capabilities in Guanajuato should demand a much higher number. The next graph shows a little bit about, with all of the investment that's taken place in Monterrey, capacity is somewhat exhausted. This is just one cost curve. Notice that this is on real estate cost, and since the announcement by Tesla, how much higher real estate costs have gone into the Monterrey area. And you have other regions here. If we look at the Bajío on the left-hand side, of course, Guanajuato participating in that grouping, it's probably some of the most competitive leases in Mexico. So it says there's a lot of room for new factories to come here, to use up existing buildings, and to go ahead and expand operations in this state at a competitive cost to China. I can never talk about nearshoring without also talking about some of the frustrations and difficulties dealing with Mexican factories in getting them willing and able to absorb volume from China. This particular graph speaks about a project we did last spring in the first quarter of 2023, so it's pretty fresh. We actually went out and found 12 suppliers to do this particular product in Mexico, only 5 of which were willing to bid, and that's fine. The other companies, it wasn't in their strategic plan or not the kind of product they wanted to go ahead and produce, and that's fine. But of the 5, notice the wide disparity between high and low in the first round bids. And by the way, this graph is in thousands of dollars. So in the high and low bid, we have a high of about $17 per unit. In the low one, we have about $7. So that's a pretty wide discrepancy or disparity of over 100%. American buyers are used to seeing a little variety in the bids of 4 or 5 or 10%. To see over 100% is very disconcerting to a buyer. Bids from China will typically be very tight in the 4 to 5% range. But also notice what happens here as we move down through 3 rounds of competitive bidding. Everyone lowers their price, including from the $7 low price bid down to $3. So here's one of the frustrations overall with Mexico. The culture in business is I don't want to leave anything on the table, so I will charge high. I know I will make concessions, but in that process of 3 to 4 months, the US buyer is very discouraged and may decide to stay in China. So it's not just where we wind up with the final numbers, but it's how long the process takes. So we simply, as a suggestion, we need to figure out ways to speed up our cost estimating process, our internal validation between various departments. For example, I imagine that the industrial engineering department that estimates cost is very efficient. But before he can publish the cost, he has to go to the manufacturing manager and validate the cost over there. And then it's still not done. Then you need to go to the finance department and they need to look at the cost and make sure everything's correct. And all of that takes time, and eventually we need to brief the owner of the company, the general manager, and say, here's where we are cost-wise, and then a price is set. Again, that takes 3 or 4 months. Typically speaking, in China, that takes 2 weeks. In the US, a buyer in the US can go to a brand new supplier, probably get a quote within 2 weeks, and have the process of negotiation finished within 3 or 4 weeks. We simply need to speed that process up. This is taking too long, and I think it's a cultural, internal communication issue in most companies. Now I want to look at how we, my company, and other sourcing firms look at Mexico in terms of obtaining a competitive price. First of all, we always look, because of what you saw on the previous chart, a wide disparity between initial bids, we always try to find 5 or 6 companies that are interested in the product. When we find those 5 or 6, we sign non-disclosure agreements with them because most US buyers are used to China. You go ahead and do a deal with the factory, you go back a year later and they've replicated it and sold it to all of your competitors. They would use the term, it's not the same product, we didn't copy it, it's similar, not same. That doesn't exist in Mexico. This is a dedicated manufacturing culture compared to China. So that's the good thing, but we're used to signing non-disclosures because we know the Chinese will engage in intellectual property theft, so we have to go through that process. Once we go through that, we set up a technical process, factory engineers talking with the design engineers, and we match that to make sure we have a good understanding of the product. And when we have that, then we do the competitive bidding and we wind up a couple of rounds later and we place the product with a factory. US companies are looking for, in a strategic vendor, a strategic long-term partnership. And I have a slide up here. I'm not going to cover all of those. I'm going to cover the ones where I think Mexico struggles the most. Not every Mexican factory is the same. The cultures are different and that. But in general, there's a great loyalty. The first one I have outlined in red. There's a great loyalty to their existing supply chain. In other words, whoever sold me raw materials 10 years ago, I'm bidding on a new project, is who I go to sell me raw materials today. And that makes sense. But what if that factory is not globally competitive on the raw materials? What if you invested millions of dollars in your equipment, machinery, you've taught your people how to manufacture, and you're tremendously efficient, but you're not buying raw materials globally competitive? You will not wind up getting the business in Mexico. We need to crack through that second layer of cost. How do we buy materials? This may speak to collaboration between, and again, small to medium-sized enterprises may not have the purchasing power to go to a large steel factory or steel mill like Ternium or ArcelorMittal. They may not have the ability to go do that, so they're going to go to a local distributor and they're going to order the amount of product they need for next week. If we have 5, 6, 15 factories collaborate together, maybe we can put out a larger purchase order that allows us to buy directly from the mill at 20 to 25% lower cost. It's that kind of collaboration that we need to foster and encourage in Mexico. One of the other comments that I've heard from time to time in dealing with Mexican factories, well, if I help my competitor, then I'm going to lose share, and it's kind of a win-lose feeling. And that may be true in Mexico. But let's take a look at the US market to which these companies want to enter. The US market in many of these areas are 50 times larger than the Mexican market. So I'll use kind of an example. Let's say the market in Mexico is $10 million, and your factory has $5 million worth of share. You have 50% of that market. And you have a competitive factory that you might lose to if you cooperate with them. Let's look at the US. The market there is $50 million. And you lost some share. You only have 25% share. So 25% of $50 million is what? $12.5 million? You are 2.5 times larger than what you were by not cooperating, or before you were cooperating in Mexico. You need to look at the bigger picture, and if we collaborate together, we fix our cost structures, we can be globally competitive, and we can take a lot of business, not from the other factory in Mexico, but from the factory in China. That's the objective. The next one I would encourage people to look at is a lot of times people are wrapped up in the percentages, in particularly gross margin as a percent of sales. It happens all the time. And what I want to ask you is, when you went to the bank last week and you wrote out a check to withdraw money, did you write it out in a percent term, or did you write it out for pesos? The only thing that matters here is real money, not percentages. So if you take home a lot more money because you're doing nearshoring and collaborating with other companies, isn't that the right thing to go do? And if you focus on percentages and you maintain a high gross margin, but you don't get the business, you didn't gain. You may feel really good about the percentages, but you're just the same size company that you were before. So you need to focus on dollars or pesos that come to you and how that flows down to the bottom line of your business. What I'd like to talk now about is, again, about this quotation process. It simply takes too long. So one of the best strategic vendor requirements, and I had to say no last week to a customer up in the Tulsa area. That customer came to me and said, can we do these products in Mexico? 3 different kinds of products. And I said, absolutely. I've been in factories that make each of those 3 products. He goes, well, that's really great. Will I be cost competitive? I said, I don't know that at the time. That's why we're going to go visit with these factories and do a bidding process. Well, can I get quotes from them within a week? And I go, absolutely not. It's not in this culture right now to turn around a quote in a week. It's a much more conservative, it's a very detail-oriented culture, and it wants to ensure that the pricing is right. No way are we going to turn around in a week. You should stay in China. Now, I don't like to give that advice in this nearshoring topic, but it is the best thing for that company to stay in China if that's what their requirement is. Now, having said that, if we can shorten from a month turnaround on a quotation or 6 weeks on a quotation to a week or 2, we'll gain a time advantage versus China. We'll pick up volume as a result of that. I want to talk about a different kind of collaboration between industry groups. Typically, industries are oriented, or factories are oriented around a single technology. For example, there might be metal castings. There might be machining for metal castings. There might be sheet metal, and then over here we might have injection molding or plastic extrusion. So companies are generally in one of those types of things. They're rarely in all of those. So the ability to collaborate across technology is kind of an interesting thing. So I want to throw up this plastic or metal to plastic conversion thing. If China is heavily subsidizing metal, then we need to find a way to be competitive. There are over 800 different resins available out there, and some of them have some performance characteristics that every good is metal. High temperature, resistance, ability to go ahead and machine to very tight tolerances, and have the similar performance characteristics as a material to metal. One of the things that happens if you look at converting from metal to plastic is you may eliminate 5 or 6 operations. I have a picture over here of some sort of device on the extreme left. This is a casting, one operation. Now there is CNC machining to go ahead and put in the screws. There's other things that are happening to us. And so the actual amount of labor in that part goes through 3, 4, 5 operations and is a significantly high cost part to make. If I move it over to plastic, I'm doing it in one step. A single step operation with much higher throughput meaning how many parts I can make per hour, much higher throughput at a much lower cost. Now, one of the objections will be that plastic costs more than steel, and that is true. However, both of them are priced in dollars per kilogram or pesos per kilogram. Steel is heavy, and let's say steel is priced at $2 a kilogram, and plastic's $4. The plastic part weighs less than half. So when you get to a pure raw material cost level, they're going to be equivalent. Then when you take out the multiple steps, the product on the right is anywhere from 25 to 50% less expensive to manufacture. Okay, so now I'm back at my parochial view of my manufacturing. I've taken metal conversion and I've given it to an injection molded company and I've lost business. Well, really, have I? Have I not made myself more important and more valuable to my client? So what they're going to go do is give me the next 10 projects that fit my technology. Net, because the market in the US is so large, because the animosity between China and the US is so huge, this opportunity is out here to change how we do things in North America and how we compete very favorably against the Chinese. We're going to need to open up a little bit of our way of thinking, and we're going to need to challenge some of our, let's say, manufacturing practices to become more competitive. And I want to leave the presentation with just a little bit in terms of philosophy. I have 2 quotes here. The first quote is by Senator Robert F. Kennedy as he was running for president in 1968. He was John F. Kennedy's younger brother. And he basically said, some men see things as they are and ask why. I see things that never were and ask why not. That's how we need to look at this opportunity. Things that we're not doing, we need to dream, and we say, why can't we go do that? Not look at our present operation and say, I can't go do that. Then the second quote I have here, and I need to read this one. There are people in every time and every land who want to stop history. They want to stay exactly where they are, stop history in its tracks. They fear the future. They mistrust the present, and they invoke the security of a comfortable past that in fact never existed. This world is always about change. When you built your manufacturing plant, when you bought new equipment, when you start up a product line to go serve somebody in the auto industry or aerospace, or you decided to make leather boots, all of those things had risk to it. But you didn't stop there. You challenged that risk and you moved forward. Thank you for your time.